good. Yeah, exactly.
Great. Well, we are live, aren't we, James? Hello, everybody. It's good to be back. We seem to be doing quite a lot of these streams now, making a lot of appearances. But yeah, so James, quite a week at the UN, from what I see. Quite a I don't know what's to say. I think we should first off just give emergency news that Nasrallah, who's the head of Hezbollah, is kaput. Everyone watching, he's no longer with us. He is the former head of the Hezbollah forces, if you want to call them that, and he's no longer with us. But it's been quite a sort of, should we say, cherry on the cake to an end of the high-level meetings in the UN. And I'm looking forward to seeing what that means for, for the situation in the Middle East. Obviously, the UN has a mission up there, but we'll maybe touch upon that in the coming few minutes and hour or so that we're chatting. So, James, I don't know. I thought it'd be good to chat with you because you're an IR wonk like me, and probably have a good understanding of the broader role of the UN in the international system. So, I don't know. What's your immediate reactions to the past week and a half of the UN?
Well, I mean, obviously this is the big time of the year for the UN. It's when all the world leaders make their way to New York for the start of the regular session of the UN General Assembly. So, I mean, essentially, this is the biggie week of diplomacy, but it now continues on for pretty much the rest of the year, and they'll be doing all sorts of resolutions and sort of work. But this is the time when all the leaders go. So it's presidents, it's prime ministers, foreign ministers converge on New York and make their set piece speeches before the General Assembly. But obviously there's lots and lots of meetings that are going on the edges of the General Assembly. So it really is, it's probably the biggest week of the year for international diplomacy, and hugely significant. And people are obviously watching exactly what different people are saying in their speeches at the General Assembly. Very often countries will use this to give a bit of a steer on, what their key foreign policy objectives are. What are the issues, the global issues that are exercising them? So what you'll see is different countries sort of raising and trying to bring to global attention and the attention of their fellow leaders what it is that they think the international community really needs to be focusing on. So it's hugely significant. And it's quite interesting because, obviously IR people are very aware that this is going on. But I think I've often had the feeling that, most ordinary people have no idea that this is taking place. It doesn't really get a lot of headline coverage. I can't remember sort of, in the UK when it would really sort of be a sort of major news item. I mean, as I say, it'll be reported in the press, for example, and you might get a little bit on, national broadcaster talking, but almost always because of one particular speech, whether it's the foreign secretary or the prime minister. This year it was actually the foreign secretary, and maybe we can talk a bit about that. But it doesn't tend to get as much attention as I think it should. So it does tend to be one of those things that sort of real IR people sort of keep a very close eye on. But to many ordinary people, it just sort of, it goes by without them really even being aware that it's taking place. But it is hugely, hugely significant.
Yeah, and as I say, there's not many UN experts that I'm really aware of. I'm also incredibly self-conscious of the fact that we're both wearing blue shirts, but one of us has bothered to make an effort to fully iron theirs. So sorry about that, everybody. Yeah, I mean, look, for me, I've worked in the UN system now for about 4 or 5 years, so I do feel it's sort of one of the thematic areas that I try to make sense of. And I think it's fascinating, actually, if you're interested in international relations, not just like geopolitics, which is sort of a little bit more dramatic, but the quintessence of international relations. And it's like a lot of people just sort of have, the UN's useless and it doesn't really do much. But it's like, when we say that, we more specifically mean the Security Council, which is fair. It's always dead. It's always in a deadlock. It's always frozen. There's always paralysis. There's always issues with the Security Council. But there are more mechanisms, and my former boss at the crisis group called Richard Goen, who's one of the more, I think, respected UN observers.
Absolutely,
he made a really good point, and I'm going to lead this to sort of one of the developments we saw this week, and put to you a question, which is that when the US and NATO forces pulled out of Afghanistan, there was no one really left to administer the, shall we say, security dynamics, to really oversee the chaos, the anarchy, and the fact that it was being run by the Taliban, apart from the UN. So no nation state's going to go in there, no sovereign government. ASEAN is useless. The Arab League are not going to do anything really. The CSTO, or I don't know, any other regional body like this Shanghai Cooperation Organization, CSO, they're not going to do anything. So it's the UN that was really the only party left to do something. Is it very limited? Yes. Is it marginal? Yes, but it's still more than the non-existence that would have otherwise be the case. Yeah. And to try and also encourage the Taliban to be a little bit more moderate with sort of, not removing every single rights of women, albeit that's unfortunately been challenging. But, one of the major, I think, highlights of this week, and this is where I want your view, James, is the revelations from the US mission and Biden administration that they are open to the idea of potentially creating 2 new permanent seats for specifically African nations. Now, 2 questions to that are, who would those 2 nations be? But 2, also a big caveat is that they wouldn't have the veto power. So they would be permanent members, but they can't really influence the power or direction of the council, which sort of many people have said undermines the whole point. I don't know what your immediate reactions are to that, and if you have anything else to build on what I've sort of tried to long-windedly lay the ground of.
Well, look, I mean, I think there were 2 sort of really key points that you were making. So I think the first is this really important thing that when we talk about the UN, I think there's a huge misunderstanding about what the UN is and what it's capable of doing. And I think you also raised this really, really important point about separating out the Security Council, which is one organ of the UN, from the wider UN and the activities that it plays. And I think, you raised the point about sort of UN staff working in the field. Now, as somebody who, as an academic working in international relations, I mean, very often, I'll have students say to me that, look, I'm really, really keen to go out and work for the UN. And one of the things I'll say is, look, that's great, but there's 2 things to know. One, it's incredibly difficult to get a job in the UN. They're very, very heavily fought over. The second thing that I'd say is that, honestly, some of the toughest people I've ever met in my life have worked for the UN. I mean, this is something that, on the one hand, you have this image of all these diplomats in New York, swanning around and everything like that, but that's not the reality in a lot of places where the UN works. I mean, it's dirty work, it's tiring work, it's frustrating work, it's emotionally draining work that a lot of them are doing. When you're in a camp in Africa, trying to deal with, the fallout from a major conflict, that's really going to test the human spirit. And I am truly in awe of so many of the UN officials I've met. Now, I'm not going to pretend that they're angels, at the risk of, I hope none of them are watching. But what I'd say is that sometimes they're deeply flawed characters. Because it takes a very, very particular type of person to be able to work in those environments over many years, and that's going to take a psychological toll. So all of this is to say that I think that when I hear people sort of say the UN is useless and it doesn't, I think, as you pointed out, they're very often talking about the Security Council. They're talking about the UN as a broad organization in their mind, which doesn't do a lot because the Security Council is blocked, but they often miss all the good work that it does. And remembering, of course, the UN is also a huge organization with all sorts of different organs and different elements that work, institutions within the UN system that, operate independently of each other, but are part of that sort of big UN family. So the second point you raised, I think, was really interesting as well, which is about the Security Council. And we can quite clearly see all the problems that have emerged. And I mean, I remember we spoke about this in the last live stream a little bit about, the problems that the UN faces and this very thorny issue of extending out the Security Council. There have been calls for years for reform, that something needs to be done. It's not representative. The idea that you've got 5 countries which were the victorious powers in a war that took place 80 years ago, still have this preeminent position in international politics is something that a lot of countries feel deeply unhappy about, and sort of say, well, look, all sort of fair respect to Britain and France, but these are middle powers these days. France obviously is a member of the European Union, a leading member of the European Union, so it can argue that it's got a lot more clout. And if I am to be completely honest, even as a Brit, I think it's very difficult to say that the UK has got this position, and again, it actually performs the job, I think, and I'm going to get all sorts of people complaining about it, but it actually does rather well. I mean, the Foreign Office actually is very well informed on a lot of world issues and takes its responsibility at UN very seriously. But of course, you've got large countries. You've got, India saying, well, why aren't we there? Indonesia saying, why aren't we there? You've got Nigeria, you've got Ethiopia, you've got South Africa, you've got Argentina, Colombia, all of these countries, Mexico, all saying, well, look, we also are major actors in our own regions, and the list goes on. I mean, even as I'm thinking about it now, you've got all sorts of other countries which would say, well, we've got to, we should be there. So I think there is a lot of pressure to try and reform it. But as you said, and as we talked about before, it's what do you do? How do you reform it in a way that is going to satisfy people and give a greater sense that, it's achieving things? Because, all right, it's fine to say 2 African seats, but which countries would they be? I mean, Nigeria and Ethiopia are 2 large countries, but people would say, but what about South Africa? What about Egypt? So, you start to get into very, very serious questions, and no one's going to be happy. And then you've got to get, all the members of the Security Council to agree on these changes, presumably the permanent 5. I think the point you raised about not having veto powers is absolutely vital. I mean, there's a good argument to say that vetoes should be abandoned anyway, because it snarls everything up. And at the moment, we aren't seeing a lot that gets done and on key issues. I mean, a lot of people point out that, well, that veto means that you can't have a Security Council resolution condemning Russia for what it's been doing in Ukraine. At the same time, the United States stands steadfastly behind Israel. And no matter what the Israeli government does, the United States will always cast its veto to stop a resolution against Israel. There have also been cases where there's been widespread international opposition to what the United States has done. And yet, it's bulletproof because of this veto. So I think a lot of people are unhappy about the veto, and the idea that you would just simply extend this out to more and more countries just would make the Security Council, which already effectively is broken, even more broken. So a long answer there to your question, which is actually my way of saying, look, the UN is actually an incredible organization. It does amazing work, but a lot of that is obscured because of this problem with the Security Council.
Yeah, it's the disunited nations, I think, is the general qualm, and lots here to say, and sort of this is a semi-interview / also conversation. So I'm gonna share some thoughts as well, react to some of what you said, because as I said, someone who's actually, I was going to be stationed actually at one point in Africa. One of the missions before the situation got a lot more unpredictable with the Ethiopian civil war, and now obviously the Sudanese civil war, which we will be covering a lot more on the channel because it's grossly undercovered. And I'm glad, James, you have done it on your channel. But yeah, from the security standpoint, you've got the G4, right? This is Japan, Germany, Brazil, and India, which argue that they should be permanent members. Now, the biggest cases for me would probably be India of those. Mainly because Germany is important, yes, but it doesn't have nuclear weapons. Japan, possibly because there's not any, apart from China, there's a limited Asian perspective. Brazil, there needs to be a Latin American perspective. But then again, the G4 is not including Africa. And to your point about which countries would it be, the case usually goes towards South Africa and then someone like Egypt, because they make up the North Africa and therefore incorporate a bit of the Arab world or Islamic world. But they are, 2 countries that are different in terms of economic development. Kenya is one of the biggest countries in terms of internationalism, with the presence of Nairobi and and others. Nigeria, population-wise, but it slowed down. Ethiopia, because it has the African Union in Addis Ababa. So there's a case to be made for various countries. But yeah, and then you've got sort of, and then there's a spillover effect as well, or snowball, which is sort of, you get India on the council. Well, then Pakistan wants to be on the council because they want to counterbalance the India narrative, and they're both nuclear powers, and therefore they should be as well. So it's very hard to know where to stop. The veto should definitely, I think, be removed or severely limited in its usage. And I think personally something like a timeout or a freeze mechanism is quite important, like freezing out certain members if they implement or behave in an unnecessarily reckless way. And that isn't just a Western thing. That applies to them, to the United States as well. And there needs to be, I think, some kind of counterbalancing mechanism within the General Assembly, because what does it, I want to also apply this a little bit in the context of what's happening in Lebanon at this moment, because for everyone who's joined since, Nasrallah has been killed. The news is seismic for what happens in the next few days, and whether the IDF will go in fully or in a lesser degree. But the point is that, a counterbalance in the General Assembly, so that if the US continues to veto every single decision vis-a-vis Israel, or the Russians do so vis-a-vis something to do with Ukraine, they can be frozen out because the General Assembly enables that. But the current approach, any policy of adding a new member, for example, like Palestine, has to go through the Security Council and the General Assembly, which is absurd, because you've got 193 nations. More than 2/3 of them recognize Palestine as a sovereign state, and therefore really that is what the democracy or majority is. But the UN, unfortunately, is, and this is the main point I want to add before we maybe jump to another question I had for you about the speeches, which is that the UN is only as powerful as the member states allow it to be. And this is a huge misconception I get very, very impassioned about, because the UN is useless. Sure, it is. But that's not because of the UN itself. It is because of member states, realpolitik. We can go really nerdy, right? Liberalism. What is the UN? It's an idea of international idealistic policies and thinking, right? Versus realism, international realism, Hans Morgenthau, Stephen Waltz, all the original ideas of structural realism and stuff like that. And they argue that states are first and foremost self-interested and based on themselves alone, whilst the UN is all about collective interests and putting the globe first. Well, guys, unfortunately, if the Russians and the Chinese and the Americans don't want to agree anymore on North Korea, then the North Koreans are not going to be sanctioned anymore, or something like that. So it's a huge shame. So people don't blame the UN as much as you should blame every country or your governments for not willing to put self-interests less than collective. But anyway, I said a lot there. James, I don't know. What do you think about what I said? And
I completely agree. I mean, it is incredibly frustrating. We always hear it, and I think this is something that, for any channel that deals with international relations, if you go into the comments section, there'll always be the comments that the UN is useless and that time to disband it. And I personally think that would be disastrous. I think the effects of trying to disband the UN, you're not going to come up with anything that's going to replace it, frankly, in the way that the UN works at the moment. You'll hear voices saying, well, what about a counter organization? Why don't we have an organization of democracies? Well, and what? The democracies talk to each other anyway. We have different groups. We have the Global South, which has an online movement. There are forums for these different groups to talk to each other. What makes the UN and what makes it so important is that it's the way that all of the countries of the world effectively talk to each other and have these meetings. And, also you have to remember that running a diplomatic network is incredibly expensive. And it's something, a global network is only something that sort of the major powers can afford to do. And even, countries like Britain and France, I mean, they really do extend themselves budget-wise to make sure that they've got embassies in as many places as they can. But certainly, I know that UK does not have an embassy in every capital of the world. It has an embassy in a lot of them. But then once you start to take into the fact that there's all sorts of international organizations, so, you've got a British ambassador to NATO, you've got a British ambassador or effectively representative at the European Union, in different organizations. So, maintaining this is incredibly expensive for a lot of countries around the world. This is just not possible. So in actual fact, what you'll find is that some of the smallest states in the world will only have a handful of embassies. One of those missions abroad will be to the UN, and it's through that mission that they then talk to the rest of the world. So, a country like Nauru in the South Pacific is not going to have a diplomatic network around the world, but it will have a mission at the UN, and that is the way that they then talk to other countries and are plugged in, if you like, to the global network of diplomacy. So the UN is incredibly important from that perspective as well. And again, I think it's overlooked. And, if you get rid of it, you're not creating, you're not going to be helping the world at all. All you're going to be doing is creating greater siloization, if you like, of different groups, which then don't have this mechanism to talk to each other on a regular basis.
And I think that one of the things that comes to mind for me as well, you seem to have frozen for me, James. I don't know if that's just me. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you all right. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. No, I think that there's a lot there. There's just a bit of a lag on the live stream. Oh, is it my live stream? Oh dear, sorry guys, I didn't know that was me. I thought it was just a lag on the whole thing. Let me see if I can figure out my internet. But yeah, basically speaking, I think that the UN is facing a lot of challenges when it comes to identity, but also sort of again, sort of recognition. People, even a couple of comments here about sort of like the UN has been replaced by BRICS. Right. So a UN system of 190 plus nations is being challenged by one of 8 or 9, of which the International Development Bank for them has put forward about $30 billion worth of loans in its entirety of existence, versus just the World Bank, which has put forward about 70 billion in just 2023 in one program area. So no, I don't think BRICS is replacing the UN, guys. It's nowhere near. Equally, BRICS is not the UN. It's an economic bloc focused on using different forms of currency to trade. It's not a multilateral organization aimed at trying to communicate diplomatic issues at the highest level of governance. This is the problem. People conflate that because there's a bunch of nations in a room together, they're all the same thing. They're not. AUKUS is a mini-lateral arrangement between the British, Australians, and English to, develop nuclear submarines for the Australians, nuclear powered, not nuclear capable. But that's not the same as BRICS. That's not the same as CSTO. That's not the same as NATO. These are different entities, guys. And if you want to be interested in following in international relations, you need to learn the distinctions between them. And the UN, for all its flaws, as I said, there is no equivalent of it. You're not going to see a bunch of nations leave and make a new UN. It's too complicated. And I supplement that point with another one, which is that China actually finds a lot of value in the United Nations for one simple reason, which is it helps facilitate its rise. It helps legitimize its significance as an international power, because whether you think China wants to reform the international system or completely restructure it in its own image, China needs the platform that the UN provides to evoke its message and narrative or perspective. And China used to be quite passive on the Security Council in the sense that they didn't block or oppose veto resolutions or something. Now they do. In the past 10, 12 years since President Xi's been in charge, the Western term known as Wolf Warrior diplomacy, so they're a lot more assertive. China's been a lot more disruptive or whatever, willing to push its own agenda on the Security Council. And that's why you've seen more and more collision and clashes at the Security Council. 15 years ago, it wasn't like that, mainly because the US was in utter hegemonic status and no one was challenging the Security Council. But now the Russians are more emboldened, the Chinese more emboldened, and the whole thing builds on that point. But to that point, James, to bring you on to the speeches, one of them that really stood out for me was sort of Biden. and he was sort of acting almost like an elder statesman. And he's sort of saying, you know, this is what we should do. The UN is the place where we've got to get everything out. I've got a video coming out in the next couple of weeks about the different types of US foreign policy, and sort of the category that they put him in the Foreign Policy magazine article was he's a multilateralist. So he looks at everything through the lens of we can do things through the international system and cooperation, yada yada. But you know, his rhetoric is quite different to some other state leaders. What did you take away from his speech?
Well, I mean, of course. Well, I mean, you know, it was very interesting to sort of pick out some of the speeches, and there were a few that I think were significant. I mean, basically for Biden, it was his goodbye speech. But I think you're very right. I mean, Biden is sort of by inclination a multilateralist. It was very noticeable that he'd spoken. I think he'd sort of said, look, you know, he'd spoken at every UN General Assembly each year. He made his way. And I think sort of had a good reception generally. I mean, remembering, of course, that there was that famous time about 6 years ago when Donald Trump went along and gave his speech and went in with his usual sort of bluster and everything like that, and ended up being laughed at when he started saying that, you know, his administration had done more for the United States than any administration in history and things like that. You know, it was Donald Trump being Donald Trump on the world stage, and he got laughed down, and you know, that probably would have had an effect in some way. Whereas, I mean, Biden, it was very much more, you know, this is somebody who went along to the UN and said, look, you know, we as the US, we want to work with the UN, and look, you know, you'll have all the skeptics and everything like that. He was saying, you know, they control the UN, and, you know, the US is just this unilateralist power. By inclination, I think you're right. You know, you'd be right to say that the US has often worked very much to its own ends, but you know, we have had administrations which are much more willing to work with the UN and been much more engaged, and I think the Biden administration has been one of those. So I think it was very telling. You know, as I say, it was this sort of goodbye speech from Biden. There were a few others that I think, you know, there were moments that stood out. I think for me, I mean, the other one, which was hugely significant, of course, was Netanyahu. So, you know, this was the opportunity to go and present Israel's case, and there was a mass walkout. A lot of countries just got up and left. They didn't want to hear what the Israeli prime minister said, and you know, it was also quite telling that they quite clearly brought people into the viewing gallery who were clapping and cheering Netanyahu as he took to the stage, and it just made, I think, in all sorts of ways, for, you know, it was not the spectacle that one would want to see at the UN in any way, but I think it sort of, you know, it gives a sense of just how unpopular now Israel is in much of the world, and I think also we have to bear in mind that, you know, that again, a lot of people would have missed over the summer that there was a very important ruling from the International Court of Justice, which said that Israel had illegally annexed large parts of the West Bank. Now, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution a few weeks ago on this. This is hugely important because it really does get down, and this is where something that a lot of viewers who'll be watching this will be saying, part of the reason they oppose the UN is because we have so many of these resolutions against Israel and nothing ever seems to happen. Now, this resolution said to Israel, you within the year, within 12 months, you should evacuate from you know, the Palestinian occupied territories, which is the official terminology that's used within the UN system. That's not going to happen, and it's just going to feed resentment in many parts, especially of the Muslim world, where people will be saying, well, look, you know, why do we vest anything in the UN when it passes resolution after resolution, and yet nothing seems to happen? And yet at the same time, of course, there's, you know, they'll point to hypocrisy that when the UN passes resolutions that the West wants, everyone's expected to follow on with it. So I think, you know, this is part and parcel of just to highlight how politically broken that the UN is. that, you know, each side is sort of saying, well, you know, why aren't you following these resolutions? So yeah, I think Netanyahu's speech was another important element of what we saw this week. I think one of the sort of interesting ones for me was Javier Milei from Argentina, because he essentially came along and gave a full-throated support for Argentina being part of the free world, as he said. So he clearly spoke out in favor of Israel. He clearly spoke out in favor of Ukraine. You know, and for many, this is very interesting because, of course, it was about a year ago that Argentina was being invited to join the BRICS. And of course, when Milei was elected in December last year, he immediately, one of the first things he did was on foreign policy, was say, look, we're just not interested in joining the BRICS. And what we saw this week was a very, very clear statement before the General Assembly that, and he said as much, that Argentina has now abandoned its previous policy of neutrality. And was throwing in with the West. So I think that was also quite an interesting speech. And he's always very interesting to listen to, whether one agrees with him or not. And, you know, for a very British reference, he is a very much a Marmite leader, that there will be some who absolutely sort of love him and think that he's brilliant. And there'll be a lot of people who are deeply, deeply skeptical about what he stands for. So I think that was a very interesting speech as well. And then, if I might, one more that I think was very interesting as well was actually David Lammy, the new British Foreign Secretary, speaking at the Security Council. And I think for me, you know, as a Brit, was quite interesting because this was the first outing of the new Labour government in Britain and a chance to make the mark on foreign policy. And David Lammy gave a really, really very strong and powerful speech at the Security Council where he was talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He openly called Russia a mafia state. He also called it an imperialist. And for, you know, anyone who doesn't know, David Lammy is, you know, he's Black British. So, you know, he quite clearly said, look, as a Black British person, you know, whose ancestry is rooted in slavery and you know, the consequences of colonialism, I know an imperial power when I see it. And it was a very interesting speech. So I think, you know, for anyone who might want to go back, and the UN often puts these up, that, you know, go and have a watch. And actually, all sorts of other speeches. It's fascinating. And I actually turn to a lot of these speeches when I make my videos, because they very often are an incredibly useful and rich source for understanding exactly where a country is coming from and its key foreign policy issues. So, you know, they'll put them up in the coming weeks, and it can be really interesting to watch all of those. But those were just a few of the stand. I've got one more which I'll mention in a little while on a different issue about future leadership of the UN. But another one that I think is worth watching because
yes, and it's
the next Secretary General.
Yeah, you said a lot there. So. Oh well, let's take a pause there, because I think there's a lot we could talk about the futurism of the futurism, is that right? Of the UN. Also, guys, yes, my background has changed and so has my lighting, because for some reason my Wi-Fi seems to prefer that I am nearer. It's in a cupboard. I don't really know. So hopefully my connection is more stable and you can actually enjoy the viewing experience. Otherwise, I'll just took James on the screen so that it doesn't look like there's someone who's being murdered or something on the other side of the live stream. But yeah, I mean, look, I personally don't enjoy Netanyahu at all. I'm not a fan of his person, but that's the point, James. You've indicated very clearly what the UN is about. First and foremost, it's about a platform for signaling. It's about a platform for posturing, and that's half the game in international relations. When diplomats walk out, people are like, well, so what? But it matters. It does. It signals a refusal, a rejection, a repulsion, whatever, disdain for the said person. But on the other hand, it's also a place where, you know, clear alignment can be given as well, in the sense of Javier Milei. He uses the platform to make it very clear, unlike his counterpart above him, you know, in in Brazil, who is much more sort of, critical of the West or the establishment. He is absolutely, Milei, this is, supportive of the US order. And, he's submitted ideas of NATO and so. So state leaders really do leverage the reach. I mean, think of what year was it? 2008, 2009, when Gaddafi, of all people, came to the UN and inspired the film The Dictator by, I forget his name, Sacha Baron Cohen, right? This is the UN is a bit of a joke. It's a bit of it's the stage. It's the international stage. It's theater, really. And you might see it as that as a little bit of a silly dramatic description, but to it is. And another example we can talk about is the Islamic Republic of Iran. When they launched that unprecedented amount of rockets in April against Israel, at the same time, they were sending diplomatic communiques, not directly to the US, not directly to Israel. They were sending it to and via the UN, because they were trying to get that legitimization and win favor with the overall international community. Does that mean that suddenly they're going to receive loads of money and they're going to be da-da-da? No, but it does mean that they have political capital, political clout, which does carry weight, because it can influence the way that trade is done, whether certain trade deals are settled, or technology and all sorts of things. And I think what's most fascinating is the first time I ever walked into New York and Geneva, to be fair, and you learn the actual experience of what's going on behind the scenes. We can read about what's on the news in terms of the decisions being made and the final products, but I don't think people have a true appreciation. And that's why I find it kind of fascinating. That's why I'm really interested in it, and why we do what we do in our respective ways, which is that the amount of backdoor diplomacy, and it's not shady deals necessarily, but the amount of, mechanisms being tweaked, hands being shaken, backs being patted, or punches being flown. It's all, I'm being descriptive here, not physical. Well, maybe, I don't know, but is insane. It's really interesting. And other countries, like the amount of money that the British, for example, and this isn't an endorsement necessarily, but just a plain fact, the amount of money that the Foreign Office or the British government commits to UN-based development initiatives or schemes is insane. I had no idea until I was working with the International Crisis Group and engaging or advocating to the UK UN mission, and really understanding just how busy they are with all these different initiatives and sort of, so it's really, really interesting stuff. But I don't know, to sort of maybe think about this in a bit more of a moving on from here. We had a discussion about the summits for the future, one of the areas that happened during the week, and this whole idea. So I wanted to have your reflections a little bit about the summits of the future, what it is. Maybe you can explain to people who are watching and listening what it is. Why does it matter?
So one
of the idea of a new leader. Yes, I want to hear, who do you think is going to replace Guterres? And why does
there's two. So one, you're right. There was this summit which has resulted in a document called Pact for the Future, which you can find on the UN website, or I think we'll both try and sort of remember to put a link in to the live stream when it's done, on this. And I think in many ways, this is a document that sets out almost 60 different areas where various countries have decided they're going to cooperate, and it deals with a whole range of different things. So it's dealing with conflict, it's dealing with development of digital communications, it's dealing with climate change, and in many ways, I think the best way to think of it is that this is, I get the sense that this was an initiative which is aimed at trying to restore a trust, a respect for multilateralism, to say that the world, there are any number of pressing issues which are only going to be addressed by countries working with one another. So I think, outlining this 56, 57 different areas is really trying to say, look, here are all these different topics, these issues that are only going to be adequately addressed if countries work with one another. So I think this was a really interesting initiative. Now, of course, a lot of people would say, well, this is probably hot air again. Yes, But even if we don't see specific initiatives emerging on each of these different almost 60 points that, as I said, I think the fact that these countries have been able to highlight that these are areas where multilateral cooperation will deliver the best results and potentially the only results, I think was very powerful. But it was also without, it didn't go without controversy, because what was very interesting is that Russia, along with a handful of other countries, tried to insert a condition on all of this, which is saying this cannot be to the detriment of sovereign states. So it was very much Russia, Moscow saying, well, this is all well and good, but there should be no override on national sovereignty, and we can't allow it. And it was defeated on that. And I think that this sort of comes back to an early initiative, which in many ways a lot of people have now forgotten about, but was incredibly powerful about 20 years ago, which is this responsibility to protect, which essentially was the idea that the UN, and it did have widespread international support. I mean, I think 170 countries eventually signed up to it, which is the recognition that there are some issues, especially on human rights, which are so important that the right for people to have the right to life, to liberty respected, overrides national sovereignty. And I think that this document in many ways didn't quite go as far as that. It wasn't an attack on sovereignty, but it was actually trying to say, look, in certain areas, we cannot let states continue to hide behind the idea that, well, what goes on within our borders goes on within our borders, and we can be, we must have impunity for what we choose to do within our own countries. I think that, that is a view that existed in the past, and a lot of people feel very uncomfortable about it, that, if a country is fundamentally abusing the human rights of its citizens, then the international community should be able to act. So I think it was quite interesting that Russia tried to introduce this clause into the discussions, and the fact that it was overwhelmingly rejected.
Yeah, so just a little bit of context about that, because I actually worked on this Pact has been in the pipeline for many years, and I think for a bit of context for people who don't follow the UN too much, Guterres is he's controversial in the sense of he's controversial for his lack of action. He's a good man, I think, in principle, but people have been increasingly, myself included, his fence sitting. He's overly cautious. He's unwilling to make commitments to certain things for fear that it might trigger a backlash. But he has tried to achieve things such as the grain deal, which was a remarkable achievement between Russia and Ukraine in summer of 22. But he could have done much more in the Ethiopian civil war. He could have done much more when it comes to Myanmar, for example, in the civil war that continues to plague there. Obviously, Sudan is an utter disaster, and it's heinous to see. Not much is being covered there at all, at least in the mainstream media as well. But yeah, I think that this pact was interesting, just to your point about the Russians. So they were among I think about 7 other nations that...
Yeah, very small number, surprisingly small.
Yeah, they rejected the final text, but they only left it until Sunday. So the Sunday before what they call high level week in UNGA, excuse me, which is sort of the colloquial term used by diplomats for the UN General Assembly week. And basically the Russians, some of the proposals were quite specific, such as a request for the Secretary General to review the state of UN peacekeeping operations, which I think is a necessary step. Peacekeeping operations are very important because they are, well, let's use the one in Lebanon at the moment to, again, keep referring back to the unprecedented developments over the past 24 hours with Nasrallah. But the UN peacekeeping operation in Lebanon is largely a husk of its former self. And the problem is that it's constrained by the policies of the UN itself. But there are about half a dozen or so, 8 maybe, nations that actually provide troops to the peacekeeping missions. The biggest nations actually being India, Bangladesh, and if I remember correctly, Nigeria is a huge provider as well. So you've got a large members of the global south providing these peacekeeping missions. But anyway, so the Russians sort of opposed a couple of details when it came to implementation or the actionable parts of the pact, I guess would say. That's usually where they sort of nation states will come out and reject things because they're like, oh, so we actually have to implement a certain thing that might not benefit our thing, and so then they water it down, a bit like they did with the climate agreements that we've seen in the past few years, where it's sort of instead of phase out or phase down. You might think, well, what's the difference? Well, quite a lot, because it means countries can basically say, well, we don't have to phase out, so we don't have to get rid of them. We just have to sort of reduce our usage of them. So language in the UN is incredibly important. And the foreign minister, Sergei Vishurnin, if I said that, I think he said it was dictated, the pact was dictated by mainly, quote, Western countries, and ignored Russia's repeated requests for intergovernmental negotiations on the text. He described the approach as, quote, despotism. So I think that's quite revealing, really. But the interesting thing is, whilst a lot of countries might agree with Russia about, I don't know, rejection of the US veto on Israel, for example, in this case, most countries were extremely critical of the Russians' move. And my own colleague Richard actually was quoted as saying, I remember in an interview I watched him gave, they were quoted as saying that Russians actually read the room, quote, quite badly, and these last minute changes were basically just completely rejected by the governing country that was overseeing the entire sort of, passing. So it was quite interesting. Instead of even humoring the Russians' alternative perspectives, they just flat out rejected them and didn't even talk about them in the UN General Assembly. So quite interesting developments there, and we do see it occasionally developing in that way. But James, I mean, I don't know, who do you think would be a better replacement for the Secretary General then? What would you like to see done if any reforms were to be made by the Security Council or broader UN system? What kind of ones would you hope? Again, I think we need to be realistic with what's possible and what isn't. What would you hope to see?
Well, I think certainly. So on the first question as to who replaces Guterres, I mean, he's got 2 more years to run. So it's, there's still a little bit of time. But in case people aren't aware, I mean, the way that it works in the UN is it goes on a rotation principle. In terms of different regions of the world, and in actual fact, the next region that is up is South America. So we, obviously we've at the moment got a European at the helm in Guterres. Before that was Ban Ki-moon. So and before that you had Annan and Boutros Ghali. If I'm remembering rightly, my Secretary General's counting them back. And then before that was Perez de Cuellar, who was the last South American. So it's South America's turn. And I think what's really interesting is that there seem to be 2 candidates that I think are the ones that are being talked about increasingly at the moment as potential standout, and both in fact women. There's also a real sense that it's time that the UN also has a female boss. That this would be an incredibly important step. So the 2 names that very often have been spoken about at the moment, somebody called Maria Angela Holguin, who is a former foreign minister of Colombia, and had been involved in the peace process with the FARC. And very highly respected, had served, if I remember correctly, as her country's ambassador at the UN, so knows the UN system well and is known within the UN system, which I think is quite an important thing. So that's one name to watch out for. And of course, she would probably garner a lot of support from the Spanish-speaking and the South American countries. But you don't get just elected on the South American countries. The other candidate, and I think she gave a really interesting speech, and it's definitely worth viewers pulling it up and having a watch, because this is another name that's going around, is somebody called Mia Mottley, who a lot of people probably won't be terribly familiar with who she is, but she's actually Prime Minister of Barbados. And she gave a real tub-thumping speech this week, was very, speaking about Palestine and her country's decision to recognize Palestine, which actually if you were to take a very cynical view, could actually be herself, lining herself up by saying, look, this is the sort of thing that would be popular with other member states and things like that. So, if you're to take a really cynical view, but she's very impressive. And I think obviously would have support from a lot of Caribbean countries and I think a lot of African countries, for example, because it would be a black woman who would be leading. And I think, that again would be something that would be very powerful. So I think there's, these are two candidates. We've got a little while to run. It'll be interesting to see who else looks like they might be in the running for it. Oh, and of course, the other advantage with someone like Mia Mottley is that she would be a very strong contender to get the Commonwealth vote. So I know a lot of people sort of look down and sort of say, well, the Commonwealth and stuff. But in its way, it's still significant. And Commonwealth leaders meet on a regular basis, what's called CHOGM, which is the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. And so she'll be a known entity within that group, which could be very, very powerful. And so it gives her potentially a large caucus, have that on my mind, a large caucus to potentially play from, a lot of African countries, a lot of Commonwealth countries. So anyway, it's just one to watch out for. But I think, there is this sense that, the time will come for new leadership. And I think, you highlight the failings of Guterres. I mean, maybe I'm a little bit more generous towards him. He was given, a very, very, it's a hugely difficult job. And, I think also like a lot of people.
Hang on. No one's denying the importance of the job or anything like that. Just to clarify, this is not like, oh, I could do that and just jump into it.
Yeah,
I
but he is dealing with an incredibly divided world, and I know one can say the UN Secretary General can take leadership.
Yeah, he should take leadership, and I've been underwhelmed, James. Sorry, I'm going to push back a little bit because I think it's
good. No, this is where
right. You're wrong, and here's why.
No, listen. And here I'll be very honest. I think Ban Ki-moon was terrible, and Guterres. I mean, probably hasn't achieved as much.
An inspiration for me. I was a big fan of Kofi Annan. I remember being in the UN General Assembly the day that he passed away in 2018. I was working on my internship at the time, and the entire UN offices or whatever, they basically just stopped. And we all met everyone, but, a large congregation of people gathered the same day. It shows you how quickly the UN can move when it needs to. But they created like a tribute, and some of the senior staff gave some I don't know, reflections and thoughts about him as someone they'd worked with, and he was an incredible guy. But of the people that you've mentioned, are you sure Mia Mottley is South American? She's Colombian?
Mia Mottley is Prime Minister of Barbados. Maria Angela Holguin is the former. It's the former Foreign Minister of Colombia. No, Mia Mottley is from Barbados.
I think both of them would be great for different reasons. I think Mia Mottley specifically because one of the biggest challenges, obviously, is climate change. Guterres has made it very unequivocally clear that, that is his primary focus. And obviously, the biggest states at risk from that are island nations. And, there's an argument that an island nation should have a representation on the council or some form because they are most at risk. How many tens of thousands of people in the South Pacific are having to already relocate to parts of Australia or whatever? We're seeing this gradually grow, forced migration. And climate migration. And it's in the interests of obviously developing nations to change this because people are worried about migration right now. Well, if we don't do something about climate change, then we're going to have to deal with this mass sort of flow from the global south as it is, which politicians with all their short-term interests in getting re-elected don't like to acknowledge. But I think should be a fantastic sort of symbolism for that, for bringing, aside from the fact that she's a woman and she represents different ethnicities and such, which is important. But I also think the fact that it's about also the mission as well. And she's a very good orator. She's a very driven woman. I think that's a great shout. I didn't know that she was in the sort of running, so to speak. So that's really fascinating to hear that. But James, I mean, I don't know, anything else to touch upon? This is the thing. The UN is so complicated, but we also don't, we could talk about it forever, but also sort of once you start making the same point, you kind of get to the point that it needs to reform. There are issues, you know, Security Council needs that, the General Assembly needs this. I don't know. What 2-3 things would you most like to see?
I mean, I think we get back to this point that I think if you get into the view that the UN, we'd all like to see reform, but it's also sort of bearing in mind that even if you can't get reform, the UN is worth keeping. I think is the key message that really needs to come out, because as I say, I think we both hear so often people saying just leave the UN should be disbanded, it's useless and things. And you know, it comes back to the original point that we're making. It is, if you judge it by unrealistic expectations, but if you understand what it does and what it does well, and that if you can understand that it quietly gets on and does a lot of very, very important work around the world, and that these are unsung heroes who are going out and working for the UN, often in very, very difficult environments, and UN peacekeepers and things like that, you know, it is achieving a lot more, and it's certainly a lot more than the blockages that one sees in the Security Council. But again, if you also bear in mind that it's a talking shop, and I mean that in the very best possible way, that this is a vital means of communication for countries to talk to each other, and for small countries to be able to speak to other small countries, to be able to speak to other regions, then in fact the UN is incredibly valuable. And I think also it's incredibly underfunded as well. You know, you will remember going to the UN building. I don't know if they've done it up a bit, but I remember going, you know, a number of years ago and being actually really quite surprised at how run down it was. You know, quite severe problems and things like that. And so it's not this lavish organization that some people seem to think it is.
No, I think that a lot of people have sort of come to the sort of general feeling that the UN hasn't really changed since its heyday of sort of 2000 and 1990s, right, when the UN was really working across so many different branches of Kosovo, Bosnia, Rwanda obviously was I mean, the 90s was a heyday of sort of the UN trying to really sort of become this opportunity to really, well, push forward this united front of sort of a singular system and identity. But at the same time, there were so many failings of the UN. The AMISOM missions into Somalia, both 1 and 2.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, just you know, Rwanda, because of the disasters in the previous years, the UN Security Council's unwillingness to get involved, which led to 1.1 million deaths in Rwanda, and then obviously the Yugoslav wars and Kosovo. So there's so many things that we have to acknowledge are the shortcomings of the UN. But at the same time, again, it comes back to this whole point, like sort of, okay, you get rid of it, fine, let's get rid of the UN. It doesn't exist anymore. But like, who's going to carry out the stuff that no one else is willing to do so? I'm thinking the Afghan example. I'm thinking, oh, here's a fun example, everyone. My favorite one. So in the 1960s, 70s, you'll know this, James, there were the Cod Wars, right? The Cod Wars is a colloquial term given to should we say, they weren't really wars. They were skirmishes and border disputes or whatever, maritime disputes between Iceland and the British or the United Kingdom, right, over fishing rights. Not exactly World War III, but it was significant
and NATO
enough.
allies, of course, yes.
A little bit, yeah. Article 5 was activated, I think, twice. That didn't happen, guys. It's a joke. But where I want to go with this sort of long-winded digression is that the Iceland government established a 5-kilometer, I think, you know, nautical zone off there, or they established basically what we now use in the basis of international maritime law. So it was the UN in 1980 or 1982, whenever it was, that established the UN Charter of the Sea. which is what all countries basically use to determine where their maritime borders lie and where international waters lie. And every country, bar maybe North Korea, I don't know, have agreed, right? And we just mutually just sort of do it. You don't hear every day a country disagreeing about X, Y, largely speaking, there is a consensus on that, and that was done via the UN, and it's incredible. But the other thing I just wanted to share was the funding thing, because I think this is really important, which is that different countries obviously have different economic sizes, and they share things. The US accounts for about a fifth to a quarter of the overall funding of the UN. Then China comes in at about 12%. The other Security Council members, so Britain, France, about 4.5% each. Germany is 6%, so they're bigger. Russia, only 2.4%. Admittedly, it's not as big in economic sizes, although it depends if you measure it in nominal or PPP of GDP. But the point is that, the US is disproportionately providing a lot. And so I think that's why a lot of people think, oh, well, the UN is basically the US UN, because they've got the headquarters in America, in Geneva, and it's all very westernized. And so people want there to be an alternative from the UN, which is not so Western orientated, which I can understand. But at the same time, I don't think you should discredit the importance of the UN as a whole, because countries use it for their own issues, and a comparison I've seen mentioned in the chat is sort of BRICS and blah blah blah. But BRICS is more of a alternative to G7. It's an economic bloc.
Yes, exactly. It's not a replacement to the UN by any stretch. I mean, the UN is the UN because it's got universal membership. It's every country. I mean,
basically, you said what I was trying to say.
Palestine as observer status and Vatican and things like that. But essentially, 193 members. Every country of the world is pretty much represented there in one way or another. It was what somebody once called the gold standard of membership of the international community. This is what every territory that's trying to become independent aims for, is to become a UN member, because that just says that you've made it, you're there, you're accepted on the global stage. There are obviously, I think there's about 6 countries that aren't recognized by every other member. I mean, Israel is one of them. I think Japan and North Korea don't recognize each other. Armenia isn't recognized by Pakistan, even though it is recognized by Azerbaijan, which is the country it's had its issues with. And Cyprus isn't recognized by Turkey. Well, but essentially, every other country is sort of recognized and recognizes each other.
And 2 points to that I would add. Apart from this one, I like this comment from Sheikh Ha about the UN headquarters should be moved somewhere neutral like Madagascar.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know Madagascar's voting history in the UN General Assembly, but that's quite an interesting proposal. Guys, if you do have any questions or comments, we're probably going to wind down in the next few minutes. But the other point I would just add to you, James, is I think that China is a great example of leveraging the UN, as I mentioned earlier, but in a slightly different context, vis-a-vis Taiwan. How do they delegitimize Taiwan's identity and an idea of achieving statehood? By forcing other member states, as well as MNCs, like private enterprises, to no longer refer to it as Taiwan, or to refer to it in very specific context and language, right? At the Olympics, it's the same. Taiwan participates, but under the acronym of Chinese Taipei, all the way because it makes China feel that they are legitimized. And so countries play ball with China. And they do that because the Chinese are leveraging the UN so effectively. So I think that's a really interesting place where, it might not have direct, immediate, tangible impacts like aggressive, but sort of more structurally systemic. You can see the changes taking effect. In the past 10 years that the Chinese have been really badgering or lobbying the UN General Assembly through the Security Council. The number of nation states that recognize Taiwan have gone down from 22 to 13 now, I think it is.
It's barely in double figures anymore.
So I think it's pretty insane. But James, I think maybe I don't know if there's any other. I wanted to know if you've got any last thoughts to share.
I think it's been a good talk about sort of the UN and things, and I hopefully, as I say, we've managed to hopefully convert a few people into understanding that, look, it's really about how we understand the UN that determines how we think about it. I know that sounds like a tautology, but it's actually, you know, it's important. It's important to sort of have the right understanding about what it is in order to appreciate how much it does. And I'm a huge fan of the UN. I've worked, you know, throughout my career on and with the UN. You know, and you know, my PhD was on UN peacekeeping and things, so I've always been a huge fan of the organization. So yeah, I mean, I think I sort of mentioned before, but it's a weird thing that in international relations you can often tell when people did their PhDs by the topic that they did. So there's a whole slew of us in the 1990s. UN peacekeeping was a terribly trendy topic to be working on. So there's actually quite a lot of people who are sort of milling around, and it's all that sort of mid 1990s. That's when you did your PhD because you wrote on peacekeeping. Because you barely find anyone who'd write a PhD on peacekeeping these days. But back then it was seen as the great hope. This was the real future of global peace and security. The UN was going to play this role, and so a lot of us had worked on it. So this is just my way of saying I've always had a lot of respect for the UN. You know, I've seen up close the mission in Cyprus, for example, for you know, for all the good and the bad points and everything like that. But it has given me a real close understanding and perspective on what the UN does. And as I say, I think it deserves a lot more credit, and it should be seen as much more than just a Security Council. So I think on the final note, I'd say, look, just I think it's worth keeping an eye on you know, what's going on at the UN. For anyone interested in international relations, it really is sort of like, you know, the main territory of global politics in many ways still, and a lot of what goes on there, whether or not you think that UN resolutions count for anything or whatever, but it's incredibly important. And do watch some of those speeches. They really are very, very enlightening. Maybe watch your own country's speech. You know, what was said, how was it presented by, you know, the particular leader, and it will be going on. I mean, you know, it takes a little while to get through 193 leaders, even if you only give them 10 minutes or so.
Well, I'm not sure I have this is an English joke, guys, but I'm not sure I have the capacity to watch Sir Keir Starmer give a speech to the UN. He's about as entertaining as a vegetable. Not that I...
Yeah, but he is the new Prime Minister, and in fact, it's David, I believe, I don't know if Starmer, I don't think Starmer, I think it was just Lammy. Yes. So anyway, but yeah, having said all of that, but I remember because it was the Lammy speech that was sort of given, which I think was quite interesting. But it does set a tone, and it's important in that regard.
Yeah, I do, and again, I want to reiterate for everyone that we're not blindsided by some ideological love of the UN or something, right? We both agree very much on the idea of... I think you're a multilateralist in your approach to international issues, and I'm not really sure if I sort of label myself too much, but I do consider myself an internationalist. People like to label me a globalist because I've worked at the World Bank, and then people don't really understand that the World Bank is part of the UN, and they're like, well, you've worked for the WHO and the UN need to be stopped. And it's like, well, guys, the UN is a body, and in that you have the WHO and the World Bank and the IMF. Right? They're all part of the same UN system. They're not governed by the same people. But this is when I just stop listening to people like that, because they have all these opinions where they don't understand it. It's very frustrating. And I'm not saying that you have to be a nerd and obsessive about the UN as I am, but like, if you're going to comment about its problems, at least have a basic understanding.
Take a bit of time to learn a little bit about it first.
Yeah. I do have a couple of...
As long as they're not going on about the WEF. You know, World Economic Forum.
Oh, yeah. Okay, right.
With the UN by any way.
We're staying on that note for another 2 hours, guys. We're going to stream.
No, I'm not. Yeah, exactly. Let's leave it there.
Lizard people and stream. What do you call them? The plumes that come out the back of airplanes. Apparently, they give you.
Chemtrails.
Chemtrails. There you go. Right, off we go. Hang on, let me get my hat. No, I mean, I'm just going to wrap up very quickly, guys, by saying, look, I mean, I think that the mistakes of the UN in the 90s, I think, have left a lot of bitter tastes in the eyes of many. this one, for example, I'm going to show a couple of comments here, which I think are worth looking at. Yes, the UN failures will lead to extensive reforms. Not extensive, no, but what does lead to reforms is pressure, and the pressure is mounting. And I do think that if you got someone like a couple of the ladies candidates that we mentioned, you could see more shift, but it's never going to be like rapid and dramatic because it's the entire international system that is trying to deal with it. The other one I did want to mention is Myanmar, because I saw that mentioned quite a few times. Myanmar is a huge disaster. And grossly underreported again. And frankly, I've been incredibly disappointed with the lack of coverage by the UN as well. But it is the first and foremost responsibility of the regional entity. And this is what the UN is trying to do, is almost designate more leadership. The UN is there as a sort of bigger overarching entity, but the leadership taking point of, say, Sudan should be with the African Union, with Myanmar should be with ASEAN. That sort of thing. So the UN, but then some people are like, well, then what does the UN actually do? So we're in this difficult time. But that being said, James, very last word, actually, anything you've got coming up you want to share with your audience that they should keep a lookout for? Because I think your work is incredibly important and needs to be promoted as much as possible. Let's be honest.
Thank you very much, Piotr. No, just this week I was taking a look at Ethiopia. Which is a absolutely fascinating country, and there's been as many people, or again maybe not, because it didn't get nearly as much coverage as it should have been, but there was a very significant war in the northern province of Tigray that came to an end a couple of years ago. But there's also a conflict that's been bubbling away in an area called Amhara, which is central to Ethiopia in all sorts of ways, and it looks like it's starting to become a little bit more serious again. So that was the topic that I covered this week. So yeah, just a bit of a quick shout out to that video. But other than that, Piotr, really thanks so much for the invitation. It's been great talking to you about all of this.
No, 100%. And as I say, apologies again for my sort of crappy connection. But you know, I'm going to sort it out. We'll figure it out. No, I mean, on the Ethiopian front, look, that was one of the main things I worked on at the UN, and I got very much involved in that. I mean, despite the Tigrayan or Tagadu people only making up about 6.5% of Ethiopia's population, the TPLF has governed for 30 plus years. The Oromos, the Amharas, they account for more than, I think, 40-50% of the population. And so Ethiopia is a fascinating country in terms of its ethnic divisions, or nationalities as they're known, and how the country has managed to avoid colonialism and has allowed it therefore to be this such diverse country, but second, how they've even allowed it to happen. And I think the most interesting part of it is they've got, I think it's Article 39 or 49, which allows for greater dissolution, not like collapse of the state, but a greater sort of autonomous provision given to parts of the country, like instead of it all being controlled in the federal government, they give them some more or regional autonomy. It's been a really fascinating discussion. But one of the things, and we will be covering that, and I'm going to share Richard's profile now. So I'll be talking with Richard on Monday about the UN and his reviews of what happened. As I said, he's my former boss, actually. I'll be transparent. I worked at Crisis Group for about a year, and he's been in and out of the system himself, but he is one of the most knowledgeable when it comes to the UN's system, everything we've discussed here with James. So if you're interested, then keep a lookout for that on my channel, as well as the Ethiopian event discussion that James has mentioned. And I look forward to seeing everyone again, hopefully in the future. But James, thank you very much. And we'll see you soon, guys. Ta-ra.